Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
How are we this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well, as usual.
Yes.
Wait an hour from now and ask me again. No, I'm doing well, and I feel very healthy, so I cross my fingers, and my family's doing well.
Good.
So I hope that's the case with your family, too.
Yes, everyone is well.
No, if any of us get coronavirus, all I tell them is, if it sounds like it, might be, stay away from the doctor. Oh, I'm a doctor, I guess you better find out what it really is. Anyway, there's lots of ups and downs and pros and cons and management of this. Who's managing the coronavirus pandemic? I remember when this was first starting that there was one commentator on Fox. He was determined to draw it out, an epidemiologist, and say, pandemic, and the guy just wanted to say epidemic, and he was the expert. But finally, he got it, and ever since then, pandemic. That means, and it is the concerns and the worries and the cases are spread around the world. But so's tuberculosis, and so are very bad colds. So's influenza, and there's a lot of danger with those diseases as well. But right now, there's some announcement yesterday, some good and some bad. I'm going to start off with one of the scaremongering title. 45,000 new cases. Get scared. No, they didn't say it. But 45,000 new cases. And our question is this really enough for people to panic and get really, really upset? Has it returned? Is it worse than ever? This is one of the worst numbers they had. Or could this be fake news fitting into a scenario where people are selling drugs and selling vaccines and also distracting from other events, all kinds of excuses. You can't say it doesn't exist, but the motivation to exaggerate is there, and people are starting to recognize this. There are some areas that are good news that we can point out, and I think it's people power. People are just saying enough is enough. Some of these real bad mayors and some governors have backed off, even with announcements like this, which means more and more coverage. And Fauci comes in and he wants to get everything back on again. He says, may be true now, but wait.
Yeah.
So I think that there is people power here. I think it's working, and that's the way it has to be at times, because I think people are sick and tired of this. So I do think there's some fake news out there. I do think that there's some explanation about why there's a lot of new cases reported, and we'll talk a little bit, about that, and even some of it right here in our own county. We might have to talk about what's going on in our county.
Yeah, we may, and the big news, there's a huge spike. We saw it started last week. They were talking about China. In Beijing, city of 25.4 million people, they found 36 cases, and the headlines in the media was big spike in Beijing, big spike in Beijing. They're shutting it down. You read the fine print in there. It's a small, tiny area, but we're seeing it here, and obviously there are some interested sources that want to bring back the panic. Governors are reconsidering forcing people to put masks on, and forcing people. They're even threatening a lockdown again. Even our own governor has threatened a lockdown if you don't get that mask on immediately. But we have to wonder, why this spike in cases? What's it all about? Is there some legitimacy? None? Is it totally legitimate? And, we've been very skeptical about the death count, because we know there was some rigging of the whole thing. Death from COVID or death with COVID. We know that not because we're conspiracy theorists, but because the CDC's own doctors, President Trump's own task force people said, just classify it all as COVID. So what about the spike in cases? Well, one explanation, and we've seen this before, is that long delayed surgeries, and we know this even from people that we know closely, people that needed to go to the hospital for events that they had elective surgeries canceled, they're going back in, but to get back in to have an ACL surgery or something, they're forcing them to get tested for COVID. And as soon as they test positive for it, they're COVID cases, they're coronavirus cases. So they're classified as coronavirus cases, even though they went in to have a hip replacement. And we're seeing a lot of that, and that's happening. Hospitalized with COVID rather than hospitalized from COVID, just like they did with deaths. And there are other reports, some of this out of Arizona, the patients are being retested each day. And that wouldn't affect necessarily the hospitalization rate, obviously, because one person to a bed, but they get retested each day, and that shows more cases. You say, well, that's fiddling the numbers. However, we know they fiddled before. And in fact, there are other factors, and you suggested, but here's our first clip. Here's one factor down here. Now, Harris County, we have a judge down here that would love to shut everything down forever. But this is Texas links record high COVID-19 cases to data backlog in Harris County. So yes, there was a lot of fear and panic, and I'm sure there are some increases in testing because people are getting tested. It's easier to get tested. Younger people are getting tested. But a lot of it is just bureaucratic, incompetence, and that's what's happened in Harris County, but it sure gave the green light to Lina Hidalgo to put everything down.
Right, and the mayor's involved too.
The mayor.
Turner announced, the mayor of Houston, said that what we have to do is watch who's doing it, and if we shame them, we'll find out. Somebody went into the store and nobody locked down and nobody did this. Let's put them on a list of shame. So logic doesn't work and medical explanations don't work. So they're going to shame them into following the orders. But one other thing that has come up to put more fear, and I think they're afraid the schools are going to open up again. The real bad people who want chaos and they don't want kids out playing, they don't want kids in school. And here it turns out kids aren't very vulnerable, almost not vulnerable at all. And it's much less than, as I remember being in grade school, I mean, a third of the class could be out, and everybody shared their childhood diseases and we got our immunity. But the patients, let's say the announcement, the title was that younger people, kids are getting it. I don't know how many numbers there are, but nobody is trying to claim medically that all of a sudden the kids are going to all get this, but it's fear-mongering. But the whole thing is, that might be a good sign. Medically, if you get a positive exposure, which happens with a lot of mild viruses, and sometimes we had 5 kids, and I know a little bit about chicken pox because there were no shots, and some of the kids would be get a lot of poxes, and some would get 1 or 2, but they got immunity. And when you only have a few poxes showing, you don't even sure we really did have chicken pox. But they end up with the immunity. So this might be a real help because they would be immune and they would be spreading that or not being able to spread it. They're not going to have the disease, but I don't think that is a negative. I think that is getting a lot of protection without getting a shot from Bill Gates. If you're positive, maybe they'll have a little more trouble coming along with inoculations to sell more shots.
Yeah, and the cases are getting younger as we're being told by the media. And actually, here's our second article. Our second clip is from our friend Jacob Sullum over at Reason Magazine. As COVID-19 infections rise, patients are getting younger. And everyone wants to blame it, including our own judge, whose face you see there on the picture. Says, young people are so irresponsible. How dare they go out? They're going out to bars and having fun. That's terrible. They should be at home in the darkness and not breathing. But as someone pointed out, and you pointed out, and you know better than most because you're a doctor, but they want to portray it as young people are killing people, they're getting and they're dying. But the reality is that actually it's good news when you think about it because younger people, as we know, are less vulnerable to this disease. As you say, they're getting it, they're helping advance the herd immunity, and as the virus mutates, it gets weaker. That's the normal process of it. So young people who are not as vulnerable are getting it, it's mutating and becoming weaker, and then later on when people who are more vulnerable will get it, it will be a weakened version of the virus and they'll be less susceptible to death, which, is what we should have done in the first place. Right. It's what you were saying back in March. It's what the Swedes have done very successfully, with some exceptions because they did a bad job with their nursing home people. And that's where most of I think 70% of the deaths in Sweden were in nursing homes. They did a bad job there. But otherwise, conceptually, they were right in what they did. And that's what we're seeing in the U.S. And how do we know that? The median age now is 35, and it was 65 for having a case of corona. But what are we seeing? Let's look at the next one, Dr. Paul. This is it. This is the main thing. This is deaths. There's a little increase toward the beginning of the week, but overall, it's still on par with a declining death rate. If all of a sudden there's a massive spike, as the headlines say, worse than ever, more cases than ever, then you would see something very significant. And again, caution, we may see that. We're not Nostradamus here, but as we're reporting what's happening now, we're not seeing, of course, deaths are a trailing edge of this. We know that. But right now, we're not seeing it. We're seeing something different happen.
You know, recently there was a Declaration of Independence, modern style, CHOP.
Yeah.
They had quite a few city blocks they declared was theirs. But guess what? The leader of that just said to the people that were doing this, just go home. You know, we won. Yeah, they won like fun. What they did, they really lost. And public pressure was put on so strongly because I think politically it's probably a very stupid move for people to say, defund the police before you have anything to replace it. And then they want to replace it with what? Anarchy and killing, and that's what they want. They're looking for that. But in this case anyway, they're saying, well, we've had a sort of a victory, so we're advising everybody to go home. And I think that's a victory for common sense and people speaking out and sensing that the danger is not here like it should be, and we should allow this to happen. That maybe we should have authority, whether it's police attacks on police or attack on coronavirus. It's this whole idea of demonstrations, I think, is not very helpful to the cause of liberty.
And I think that's part of it, but I think the other thing is it's a political issue, and it is an absolute fact that Black Lives Matter is funded by groups that also fund the Democratic Party. It's very closely affiliated with the Democratic Party. There's no question about it. I think what may be happening, and we've talked about it before, is this kind of thing. This is 1968 with Nixon. You know, the country is in chaos. There are riots in the street, and here comes Nixon with his law and order. This is what's, to us at least, is looking like a political liability for liberal cities and states like Seattle and Washington overall. And I think it was becoming a thorn in the side, and I think that may be one of the reasons, beside the fact that they've lost and nobody wants to live in a drug-infested hellhole like it was becoming. Other than that, politically, I think there are some reasons why they want to shut this down, because Trump could very easily grasp onto this and say, is this what the kind of thing you want leading the country?
I want to touch again on Texas about the 1,500 increase in coronavirus infections. And here it turns out that our county judge is really upset about this because unknown to him, the state transferred 1,500 prisoners, and I'm sure there were more cases there, into the prison system here in our county. And, excuse me. And that he annoyed him, to say the least. So what he's saying, none of this is true. These statistics are fraud. I'm not even going to keep records anymore.
Yeah, and it embarrassed him because, you know, obviously it's going to look bad on him. Brazoria County has thankfully not been very affected by coronavirus, despite having some reasonably sized cities in it. Has not been particularly affected. Then all of a sudden, I think it was 800, if I'm not mistaken, prisoners with COVID were transferred in, and it showed up on the Brazoria County charts, and it looked like, oh my gosh, Judge Sebesta has lost the plot here, and the place is going to the dogs. And you could actually see, and I noticed it about a week ago, that there was kind of a peak in fear in Brazoria County, at least the places that I go, which aren't that many. But stores and things, they started getting more aggressive with masks. And I think it's because these numbers jumped, but they jumped for something completely unrelated to a spreading of it. It had to do with the prisons. Judge Sebesta was right to say, come on, I'm not even going to count this anymore. This is a joke. There's just no way to, and it wasn't just in Brazoria, it was other counties in Texas too.
You know, excuse me, in Nevada, they do gambling there, I understand. There's a little bit of gambling on there in Las Vegas. But it looks like they didn't want to gamble with more lockdown. That was a bad gamble. So what they've done is the governor, has announced that there will be some rules fake rules, that there are no penalties, and they won't apply to homeless. Well, that's neat. You know, if you're homeless and you get a hospital, you don't have to be counted. And people under 9 years of age, they don't count, and there will be no penalties. So I think this is common sense waking up, and I think really that people do weigh the fear and the danger, and I think they saw much greater dangers. The mayors and governors who move away from all that lockdown stuff. I think they're saying, well, I don't want to gamble with all this lockdown stuff. Too much is lost. The cost is too heavy, and people still die.
Yeah.
And I think more people every day are starting to recognize this, and I can't understand why the average American people don't think that we should allow baseball to be played. You know, pretty soon, I think the 6 feet will shrink to 4, and then it's going to go to 0, because you see the crowds out there, they're on the beaches and everything. Maybe someday in our lifetime, we'll see baseball players again and sitting together. Maybe someday there'll be a time when you can actually sit next to somebody. And of course, I don't like the middle seat to be taken anyway on an airplane.
No kidding.
But economically, that's not feasible. But anyway, time will tell. But the solution to this is waking up the American people and the people resisting it. I think that's what's happening.
And and people naturally socially distance. Nobody likes a person who crowds their space.
Right.
But you mentioned this Nevada thing, and it's really interesting because, again, it's like we talked about in Oregon. The Nevada governor comes out and says, you better wear a face mask. Everyone has to mandate a face mask. Oh, and by the way, the homeless are excluded. We can't. Probably because you can't find them, right? They have no money. But it's like in Oregon. Oregon said, well, people of color are excluded. Well, either the masks prevent the spread of the disease or they don't, in which case they're just theater. If they really do prevent the spread of the disease, then the authorities in Oregon would like black people to die, and the authorities in Nevada would like the homeless to die. You know, I mean, that's the only two possibilities. But what really is happening, we saw this in Harris County here, is that the authorities are like you said, people power when we started. The authorities realize that people are not buying this. These aren't laws. They haven't been passed by legitimate legislatures. They're just dictates by people like Lina Hidalgo. So they realize they cannot mandate it on people, but what they're doing is pretty nefarious because they're going after businesses because they can affect their business license. And so they're telling businesses, if you don't require people to wear face masks, we're going to fine you $1,000, $2,000 each time. The businesses panic. Of course, they don't want to deal with thousands of dollars in fines. Plus, they don't want to deal with a liability. So they're forcing private companies, private businesses to act as enforcers to their ridiculous face mask laws. And I think that is pretty dangerous.
Yes, and I think that that's where we're making the progress. People are starting to realize that, and Oregon is a pretty good example of this because they will have to back off, and it's they talk about who has to wear the face mask and they exempt minorities, and you make a good point. Well, if it works, why wouldn't you really do it? Because they don't believe in this mask, but they still have a law on the police because the people behind this have a lot of money. And they get first choice on the vaccines. Yeah. They're lining up, which once again, we don't like the vaccines. We think there is some danger. But if there is a little bit of confusion, our society was supposed to mean that the decision was made by voluntary decisions, that you and I as parents can make a decision, and others can. But to say that, oh, all blacks get masks, no blacks get masks, they get the vaccines, other people don't get the vaccine. This is a great example of the horrendous errors in central economic planning. And then when you get into medicine, having medicine determined by bureaucrats and drug manufacturers, it just doesn't work. That's why I still maintain that the best thing to do to never have this happen again is just separate medical care from the government.
Yeah.
But as soon as you do, this was predicted about when the government pays the bills, you will have euthanasia. Because old people, require too much more. In a way, some people say there's maybe a little bit of that's going on, but who's dying? Most of the people dying in a nursing home. Yeah. Well, that's just, you're distorting things, and that's true. They're all sick and all this, but it's a little bit strange. If you look at the percentage of people over 60 totally, the ones that were in the nursing homes and that weren't in the nursing home, but they were in the nursing home because they were very, very sick. But anyway, they put it all together and say, look at how many people are dying, and it's just mismanagement. It's a system that is controlled and manipulated by people who have a lot of investment in this, political investment as well as monetary investment. And this is just really starting because the vaccine will come out soon. And I've come across some people that are still very concerned about the virus, and they think they should be cautious, and some should be.
Yeah.
But they're not. They told me they're not all that anxious to take that vaccine. So there's enough caution out there about vaccine that hopefully they don't line up like crazy. Please give me my vaccine, and thank Bill Gates for me.
Yeah. Well, if you look at polls, and I've seen a few of them, and maybe they're not scientific, but there's a massive resistance to taking this vaccine. 60, 70, 80% do not want to take it. Unfortunately, for our men and women in uniform who people love to applaud, they're first in line. I saw an article yesterday saying the first front line of the people that are going to get this vaccine are the people in the military. Great. They get to serve as the guinea pigs for everyone else. It's terrible, and they're going to suffer, and it's just terrible. But I think we're to the segment on Thursday where I'm going to do a villain of the week, Dr. Paul. And one of our viewers, and I appreciate this, sent in a very good case that it should be the governor of Maine, who is a very, very bad person and a real authoritarian. So she's a runner-up, the governor of Maine, who shut the state down and all sorts of horrible things. But when you talk about monsters, real monsters, and you suggested either, who's the monster that said you got to put sick people in with well people in the nursing homes? And he's up to something else now, Dr. Paul. If we can skip to the very last clip, the villain of the week has to be Governor Cuomo. This guy is on the rampage. He is going to have his police stop randomly anyone with out-of-state license plates who's traveling in New York and they're forced to quarantine for 2 weeks if they enter New York. You fly into New York, we'll have your name. We'll know where you're supposed to be staying. It's what Cuomo told CNN, and I want to thank our viewer Maureen for sending this because definitely someone like that is the villain of the week.
There you go. You don't have much trouble finding villains, do you?
Too many.
They're coming for you. I want to just close with a brief statement about Politico, and that's a mixed bag there. But sometimes they come up with very decent information, and they had one recently describing and going over the Lancet issue. That's when Lancet wrote this article, and it was all fake news, and they had to remove it. They had the credibility of the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet, and their credibility was blown because they gave all fake news. The data was wrong, and they would say that you should never use chloroquine, and they went over all this in great detail. It's worth reading. And then they advised that this is all fake. And what it did was it destroyed the credibility of those articles, but it also started destroying the credibility of so many other things like that. But this one, when Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, I would say that theoretically they have more clout than even Fauci. And this to me is a good sign that people are thinking about it and looking at it more, objectively. So I think Daniel is probably right, and hopefully so, that the people aren't going to flock. Please give me my vaccination. Maybe they're going to wake up and see that nobody under 50 died in an unusual number. Maybe it'll be less than the influenza or whatever. So I think the people are going to wake up, and I think that's our job. Try our very best to present the case for being a little bit more objective in analyzing a situation like this, because interestingly enough, it involves medicine, it involves politics, it involves emotions, and there's a lot of reasons why people are responding, and then you have the violence involved too, and the radical politics like the Marxists, the cultural Marxists and the economic Marxists. This is a good deal. They love this. The more chaos, the better. But I think we're making progress. We're going to continue to do our best to bring you what we think is happening and why actually, the most important thing I can say, be cautious. Don't accept blindly this stuff that you read about. And I think that's what's happening. And that's why the people are stepping in and saying, we don't want this. And the mayors have started to change their tune. That's good news. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.